If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. I thought it would be helpful to do occasional episodes on questions that I get from clients, prospects, and listeners. This will be one of those episodes. I'm always happy to get questions, so if you have one that you'd like for me to deal with, just let me know. You can send it to larry@dobusyright.com or connect with me and message me on LinkedIn. I can't guarantee that I'll get to yours, but if I do, I'll let you know which episode to listen to for an answer. In these episodes, I'll answer one or more questions depending on the length of the answer. Check the show notes or just stay tuned until the end. Here we go with question and answer time. Today's question is really common. I get this from probably 60 or 70% of people who don't yet have an attention compass implemented for their workflow. So the question is, my task list just keeps getting longer and longer. What do I do about that? Is that normal? How do I manage that? So there are a couple of things here. And at the beginning, I'll take kind of two tactics on this question. So the first one is, if you're constantly having to ask yourself, what do I need to do now? Or what do I need to do today? You can seriously count on your brain to come up with some things. Now, whether or not they're the right things is actually pretty questionable. The best way to manage new tasks or new ideas is to have a backlog where you can put these things while you decide what their priority is and when is the best time to attack them. If you have a backlog and manage it well, then you'll start every day with a task list that's at least mostly ready for you to start on. Now, there's a whole process and tool set here. In fact, this is a core function of your attention compass. So I'll say more on this in other episodes. I think another way to approach this question, or another way to answer this question, is to make sure that you understand or recognize that things can come off your to-do list. And we'll go into detail on this part now. Most people default to the following statement, whether they're aware of it or not. And the statement is, if I decided to try to do it yesterday and didn't get it done, then it is automatically a priority for today. Well, like most absolute statements, this one is not automatically true. It may be or it may not be. So we have to think about whether or not a task from yesterday needs to move to today's list. And there are some implications of dealing with that well, as I sort of mentioned before. Two scenarios, really. And the first scenario is, of course, if you're facing an imminent deadline, then the task is going to move to today's list, and you're just hoping it's not late. In this case, my best advice is for you to brew some coffee and call your spouse and tell them you're going to be late getting home. But also realize that this is an excellent case for you to focus on producing the minimum viable product. Now, that may sound bad, minimum viable product, and we'll talk about it more in another episode, but here we are. You're at a place where your time is crunched. You've got a limited amount of attention that you can pay to this because you've already got things to do today. And so you just need to push it out the door and get it done. But while you're thinking about the task, try to figure out, and this is based on the Pareto principle, try to figure out that 80% of the result that's produced by 20% of the effort. It's not always true, but it's close enough that we can use that as a rough rule of thumb. But what you can't do is let it conquer the rest of your schedule. Figure out the minimum amount of time or the maximum amount of time, depending on how you're looking at it, that you can apply to this task, and figure out a way to get it done within those constraints to the best of your ability. Feel confident in your skill set and deliver your result. And it will probably work out just fine for reasons that we'll talk about in a minute. But also, I don't want you to beat yourself up here, but I want you to use this situation as a sign that you need to get your productivity system straight. And of course, I can help with that. I will say that many of us have developed a deadline-only mindset in our work, and we don't do anything until the deadline pressure forces us to do it. If this is you, you face what I call attention debt, and you'll need to get back to harvesting wasted time, and I'm saying wasted time with air quotes, but you'll need to get back to harvesting that wasted time to get on top of your work, on top of your workflow, and get out of debt. Part two of this question, if you're not facing an imminent deadline, you're working on the important but not urgent kinds of tasks that everybody has in their life. So the first thing is to recognize that you don't have high deadline pressure, and therefore you can still choose when to do the task. Recognize that you brought the item into your list because you thought it had a good context yesterday. You thought yesterday would be a good day to do it. Now, while you're recognizing that, also recognize that today's context is almost definitely different and may well not be a good context for this particular task. If all that's true, then you can properly postpone the task. So this means getting it off of your current to-do list and putting it on another list. Okay. And again, there needs to be a reliable system for this, because otherwise it'll stay in your brain and you'll constantly fear you're going to forget about it. So if you want to properly postpone the task, here's how you go about it. One is identify the next day and time that the best context will be available to you, or you'll be able to create that correct context to do the task. You'll postpone the task until that time. And that means, of course, take it off of the current list and otherwise forget about it. Again, you don't want it hanging around in your head. And ideally, it's also not hanging around on your list. Once you've done those two things, then it's time to get on with the work that you had planned for today. Now, if you're in that second category, you're not facing an imminent deadline, but you automatically move things from yesterday forward to today, then I think you have a habit that you learned actually a fairly long time ago. And we'll talk about what that is, because it's time to get rid of this habit of thought for most of your tasks. So we'll explain the habit, where it came from, and then I'll talk about steps to deal with it. So the habit is that almost all of us grew up with a deadline-driven productivity process. I say that because this is pretty much what we're taught when we're in school. So the nature of the work that we do in school is such that it almost always falls into category one that we talked about earlier, and it has an imminent deadline. But all of that comes dressed up in disguise, and here's what I mean by that. In school, we're trained or required to deal with things in a deadline-driven manner. We have to deal with them according to their deadlines. For whatever reason, this is the way our primary education is structured. And it's based on the nature of the tasks that we have in that situation and how they're assigned to us. And I'll explain what that is in order to try to contrast it with what's going on in the work world. In school, all deadlines are hard deadlines. There's no grace period. So I realize that some teachers give some sliding deadlines. So like if it's a day late, you face a 10% penalty on your grade, and other different ways to approach this. And I like this approach, but it's actually very rare. It's typically not available on tests. and we have no training in how to deal with that sliding deadline effectively. This again is during our schooling and during our schoolwork. In addition to that, a partial result is not useful. So you can't say, oh, I only prepared for half of the test. Let me take that today. And then next Tuesday, I'll take the other half of the test. So that's kind of the first thing, is this hard deadlines that we're trained to expect. The second thing is, for a lot of us, the only acceptable result in school is an A. That's fine as a goal, but the task is not well defined enough for us to understand how much work it'll take to accomplish that A. In other words, we may develop some experience for how long it's going to take us to learn something, but changing subjects can change that amount of time. We don't really know the content of a test. We just know in generalities. Now, we get off into college and secondary education, and more often we get a grading rubric handed out to us in advance. And this is particularly true on projects. And on project work, it may even fall back into our primary education projects. And that helps us to understand the amount of work that's going to go into getting an A, but it's really not standard procedure. So if we understand, that, for example, on a project rubric, maybe you're making a diorama in 8th grade, and the teacher tells you that it's a 10% penalty if the background is not painted well. In that sense, an adult could make a decision, which is it worth the extra work to get the A instead of the B? But again, that's really not the way we're trained in primary school. And we carry all this stuff forward with us, right? So if we're talking about tests and exams, which is the most common task, particularly in the early years, there's no mechanism to bank work. And by banking work, I mean do some of it well in advance and hang on to that work, and then do some more of it later and hang on to that work. You really can't do that with tests, because mentally, most people believe that studying too far in advance of a test is useless because you'll forget what you learned. And this is the nature of the question and answer, the memorization function of most tests that we deal with as children. In addition, we usually don't know the entire content of the test. And even if we do, we're not usually taught, at least some of that content is not usually taught until right before the test, sometimes the day before. And what we see is the teacher teaches for 2 solid weeks, and then we have a test on the day after that unit or whatever is finished. So it's very difficult to plan our work for that and other reasons. And then the other piece, finally, in progress feedback is not usually available. It would be nice if we could get a copy of the test 2 days before the scheduled test, but teachers, as you well know, are pretty funny about having the questions out because they're afraid we'll just memorize the answers. And I sort of get it on process-based testing. Process-based testing is like in math. Okay, so they're not really all that concerned about whether or not the answer is 4. They're concerned about whether or not you can derive the correct answer. So they don't want you to memorize stuff. But in things like history and English grammar and all those sorts of things, memorization would be a perfectly acceptable form of dealing with a test. But the general school environment doesn't allow that function. So it's unusual for us to be able to do some work and see how far we've gotten towards our goal. And then that's actually a mechanism that we could use to estimate the remaining work on our task. So to recap the 4 points on the nature of the work that we learn to do as young people, Number one is all deadlines are hard deadlines. Number two is, for many of us, the only acceptable result is some form of perfection, 100%, or at least an A. There's no mechanism to do work ahead of time and store it, that is, to bank up some work. And then four is in progress feedback is not usually available. So together, these things teach us that setting early deadlines doesn't work, because we'll still feel that we need to do one more review. We need to read through our notes one more time. And that if we do work too far in advance, then our knowledge, that'll be wasted, because our knowledge will erode between the time we do the work and the time we take the test. It also teaches us that work naturally, and I'm going to say automatically, expands to fill the available time. So this is a feature of the fact that we're all seeking perfection here. And what happens is we'd better take another look at it, because we don't know what the actual requirements are. So we're not confident that our memory is good, and we don't understand what is going to be on the test, so we can't memorize it. And so we just automatically feel driven to review it one more time. 5 minutes before the test, you're sitting at your desk with nothing to do. You flip through your notes one more time. And so that indicates to us that work expands to fill the available time. The third thing that we get taught is, therefore, we need to put in as much work as we can between now and the deadline. Now, that may or may not be true in school, okay, that you need to put in as much work as you can, but that's really your only option. That's the only measurement that's there. Because the only other measurement that makes sense is, I'm done studying, I've done enough work, I've fulfilled the requirement, here you go, here's my result. And we don't have really enough information to determine that that's true. So one of the results of schooling and the way schooling works is that we understand that early deadlines don't work, that work expands to fill the available time, because we need to put in as much work as we can. Okay. If you bring home a B, what do your parents typically say? Well, they say you should have worked more or harder to get an A. And so we then just, our default position is the only logical one, which is, I'd better spend as much time on this as I can before the deadline hits. So all of those things together teach us this fundamental rule that I alluded to a minute ago, which is, if we didn't put time in yesterday, or we didn't put as much time as we thought we were gonna, then we're automatically behind, and we need to force the work into our schedule today. We learn these habits when we're very young people. And the environment that we're in is a very structured environment, and it's very, very different from the modern workplace environment. So now that we're adults and we've moved out into the work world, we understand a little bit more about ourselves. We can begin to question those ideas with the notion that we're going to take apart the fact that work that wasn't done yesterday automatically needs to get done today. In contrast to the school environment, we have the work environment. And some big differences are, we need to recognize that in the work environment, many of the deadlines are soft deadlines, or they're at least negotiable. And that often a well done partial result is quite useful. So instead of this binary all or nothing, here's the deadline, be ready for this at 10 o'clock on Tuesday, and you'll have 50 minutes to tell me everything you know on this test paper. Instead of that, typically in the workplace, deadlines are at least negotiable. And the outcomes that people need are not usually rigorously defined. So we can manage the amount of work we put in with some experience and some judgment. The second difference is we don't get graded on work in the workplace, at least as rigorously as we get graded on work in the classroom. So most of the time, our best effort, and I'll detail this more later, our best effort is what's expected. In other words, there's not a rubric for our work. There's not 100 math questions that each get 1 point, and we're going to get graded. Our work is going to get graded this way. In a lot of cases, it's even fair to say that done is done, and what you produce is, in fact, what was required. In the workplace, we are usually able to bank work, okay, like we talked about on a school project, which is, okay, well, we'll do some of it now, and then we'll do some other things, and then we'll do more of it later. But regarding banking this work, and in part due to the training we received in school, either intentional or unintentional, we don't know how to bank work very well at all. It's typical for people to complain that they put in 30 minutes starting the report or starting the PowerPoint presentation or whatever it is. They put 30 minutes into doing that work and made some progress. But then when it's time to work on it again, they spend 30 minutes trying to find their previous work. And so these things interfere. While we have the ability to bank work, these things can interfere with our process of banking work, but we are able to do it, and that's a very important factor. And the fourth piece is kind of unlike a school test and most school projects, we can usually get some in-progress feedback on our work. It might be, wow, this is going to take a lot of time for me to go through this and give you feedback, or there is a problem with nobody's particularly good at giving in-process feedback, or perhaps, actionable feedback at all. But some, in this case, is better than none. So we do have the opportunity, if we'll take advantage of it and create the opportunity, to get feedback kind of mid-course and to say, hey, is this the direction that you wanted this to go? How does this look to you? What's the biggest problems that you see with this result as compared to what you were expecting? And I'll recap those four things. So in fact, in the workplace, many deadlines are soft or at least negotiable. We don't get rigorously graded, so often our best effort is what's expected and what's needed. We are able to bank work, but we need to figure out how to save that work well so we can get back to it when we need it. And finally, we can request in-progress feedback. Many workplaces are taking steps to be more friendly to in-process feedback. So altogether, these four things really mean that our habits from school are not really always applicable to our work and our jobs. A job, the environment in the workplace is very different from the school environment. You may have heard that schools were designed to produce good workers circa 1940 or 1950. And I can neither confirm nor deny that. The research is equivocal on that. But whatever it was designed to do, we no longer have these rote jobs, these 100% administrative jobs. Okay, we now have these creative jobs where people are looking to us to solve problems. And so there's lots more flexibility in the workplace in many ways than there ever was in our schoolwork. And so those habits that we developed, I think, and presumably from our school days, we need to reassess those and rethink that and make sure that we're approaching this work in the right way and not out of habits built to try to succeed in another context. So all of that piled up together means that our habit of thought that makes us believe we automatically need to move yesterday's work to today, that habit of thought is probably no longer accurate. And this moving things that didn't get finished yesterday, automatically moving them to today, is a problem that we can attack in a situation that we don't necessarily have to engage in. And there's lots of thinking around this, and particularly about, okay, how do I plan the work in smaller chunks? How do I ensure that I'll do those smaller chunks? How do I store that intermittent work product so that I can find it again when I need it? I really want to be careful on this recommendation. And that's because it hinges on two really challenging ideas. The first idea is that we know the difference between postponing and procrastinating. Postponing is a sophisticated management technique, and particularly a sophisticated self-management technique. We have to realize that we can't do everything at once, which means automatically, so to speak, logically, it means that some things will have to be postponed. And we're constantly doing this postponement. We need to have a system that supports that postponement. And thus, we're able to do one thing at a time and feel good about it, feel confident that everything's going to get done. So that's what postponement is. Procrastination is a problem. Postponing is planning to do work at another time. But procrastinating is very different. It has some other causes. And we'll explore that in another episode, but we want to make sure that we understand the difference between postponing and procrastinating. And that if we're getting into procrastinating, that's not good. And we can identify that and work our way out. So that's the first challenging idea. The second idea, and this is where a system really comes into play, is that we can track our decision to postpone. And this is one of the primary features of Attention Compass, is that it allows us to track postponing work. So we've got to have a way to keep track of our decision to postpone the work, and we have to have 100% air quotes, confidence in it. So if we are to confidently postpone work, then we need to be confident that we'll see it again. So again, I want to be real careful with this area, because these two ideas, these two challenging ideas, are important in answering the question. So the first is, we know the difference between postponing and procrastinating, and we know we're not just procrastinating. And two is, we have a system that helps us postpone ideas. In other words, we put it off, but we don't forget about it. At some point, I'll deal with those two challenging ideas in the podcast. And I think as you listen to different episodes, you'll see how they apply. We'll certainly do an episode on procrastination. Spoiler alert, procrastination is probably not laziness or some other moral failing. I think it has root causes that we can deal with. So look for that episode. And then talking about the system that helps us keep track of our decisions to postpone, that's the backlog system for our tasks and our work. And really, that's an Attention Compass implementation. And one of the primary goals of engaging in an Attention Compass implementation is so that you can confidently say, no, I will do that later. So at some point, I'll deal with those two ideas throughout the podcast. The best way to figure out these two things is to go ahead and get started implementing your own Attention Compass. And again, one of the primary purposes is to handle postponement decisions well and to keep track of your backlog. During implementation coaching, we deal with the difference between postponing and procrastinating. And again, I'll do an episode. So if all of that's something you need, feel free to reach out to me and we can get you started. In the meantime, start developing ways to keep your task list from growing. This is not the way your life should be. You shouldn't be constantly presented with a long list of things that you know you're not going to get to. This is a problem because it's a distraction. Long lists are hard to process, and our brains default to finding anything that will allow us to make the list smaller. This leads to filling our days with small, trivial tasks in order to relieve the pressure we feel when we look at our lists. It does not lead to doing our highest and best work. The quickest solution is to constantly assess our process. If we automatically move yesterday's undone tasks to today's list, along with adding new assignments and ideas, then our list can only grow when it gets unmanageable pretty quickly. Develop the means and tools to effectively postpone tasks until you arrive at or can create the proper context, until the right time to do the work presents itself. If you actually constantly face deadline pressure, then consider how you can start working earlier and keep at it in meaningful ways. You might have to sacrifice some streaming time or some Facebook time. If you decide to do that, make sure you're using some of that time to work on your system and on your mindset so that you don't fall back into the ever-increasing task list scenario. I hope I've answered the question to your satisfaction. If not, keep asking it in different ways, and we'll get to a solution that supports and helps you. As I said, I love having questions to answer. So reach out and let me know what I can talk about that's most valuable to you where you are now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.